We are already flying home when I turn the Lancaster around. Somewhere behind us, another crew is still in trouble. Fuel is limited, and the darkness offers no certainty. I set course back toward occupied Europe. The aircraft was already on its way home when the pilot made the decision that later disappeared into the paperwork. Behind him lay a night of confused orders, scattered formations, and targets that could not be identified with certainty. Ahead was safety, or at least the hope of reaching an English airfield before fuel and weather closed in. Yet somewhere over occupied Europe, squadron leader Leonard Cheshire turned his aircraft around. Official reports recorded the mission, the bomb load, the route, and the losses. They said far less about why one experienced pilot chose to reverse course after the operation had effectively ended. The reason was not a new target. It was a missing crew. On the night of January 30th, 1943, the war in the air over Europe had entered one of its most difficult phases. Britain's Royal Air Force was conducting an expanding strategic bombing campaign against German industry and military infrastructure. By then, Bomber Command had learned that sending hundreds of aircraft across occupied Europe was not simply a matter of reaching a city, dropping bombs, and returning home. Every mission depended on weather forecasts that could fail, navigators working with limited information, engines operating for hours in freezing darkness, and crews who often had only seconds to react when something went wrong. The men who flew these missions were not always famous. Most were known only within their squadrons. A pilot might complete dozens of operations without appearing in a newspaper. A navigator could guide an aircraft across thousands of miles and leave behind little more than a name in a logbook. When an aircraft failed to return, its disappearance was often reduced to a line in an operations record, missing. Leonard Cheshire was not yet remembered as one of the most remarkable figures of Bomber Command. In January 1943, he was still a young officer learning through experience, failure, and survival. He had already flown numerous operations and had developed a reputation for persistence, but he was operating in a system where courage alone could not solve every problem. Orders were strict. Fuel calculations mattered. Formation discipline mattered. The chances of helping a crew after an aircraft had gone down over occupied territory were usually close to zero. That night, Cheshire was flying a four-engined Avro Lancaster. The Lancaster had become one of Bomber Command's principal heavy bombers, capable of carrying large loads deep into enemy territory. But its size and power did not make it invulnerable. A damaged engine, a navigational error, or a sudden change in weather could turn a planned return flight into a struggle for survival. The target was in Germany, part of the continuing effort to disrupt the German war economy. Before takeoff, the normal preparations took place. Maps were studied. Routes were discussed. Fuel requirements were calculated. Each crewman knew his position and responsibility. Once airborne, the pilot would depend heavily on the navigator, bomb aimer, flight engineer, wireless operator, and gunners. A Lancaster was commanded by one man, but it survived through the combined work of 7. The journey toward the target was difficult almost from the beginning. Cloud obscured landmarks. Other aircraft crossed nearby in darkness. Searchlights and anti-aircraft fire created further confusion as the bomber stream approached enemy territory. The sky over a heavily defended target could become crowded with aircraft flying at slightly different heights and headings, each crew trying to complete its own task while avoiding collision, fighters, and ground fire. Cheshire's Lancaster reached the operational area, but the conditions made accurate bombing difficult. Like many crews on similar nights, his men were forced to make decisions based on limited visibility and incomplete information. The bomb aimer might see only brief gaps through cloud or smoke. The navigator had to keep track of a position that could never be known with absolute certainty. Once the bombs were released, the aircraft turned for home. For most crews, that was the moment when the second half of the mission began. The return journey could be as dangerous as the attack. Aircraft were often scattered after leaving the target. Some had damaged engines. Others were running low on fuel. German night fighters waited along likely routes. A crew that had successfully survived the bombing run still had hundreds of miles to travel. Somewhere behind Cheshire's aircraft, another bomber was in trouble. The exact circumstances were difficult to establish in the darkness. Wireless communications were limited and often unreliable. Crews could not simply exchange detailed messages while flying through enemy airspace. The bomber stream was spread across a wide area, and aircraft that disappeared into cloud could vanish from sight almost immediately. What became clear was that one crew had not returned with the others. For most of Bomber Command, the established procedure was painfully simple. The remaining aircraft continued home. Search and rescue over occupied Europe was almost impossible. A pilot who turned back risked his own crew, consumed precious fuel, and could accomplish little. The air forces had to operate according to hard calculations. One missing aircraft could not normally justify placing another in the same danger. But Cheshire had spent enough time in operational flying to understand the weakness in such calculations. From the ground, a missing aircraft was a symbol on a plotting table. In the air, it contained 7 men. As his Lancaster continued westward, the decision began to take shape. The aircraft still had fuel, but not an unlimited amount. Weather over Britain could be unpredictable, and diversion airfields might themselves be affected by cloud or poor visibility. Turning around meant returning toward danger. It meant giving up distance already gained. It also meant that the crew could face enemy fighters after leaving the relative protection of the bomber stream. There was another problem. Cheshire did not know exactly what he would find. A damaged aircraft might have crashed. It might have changed course. It might already have crossed the coast. Searching for it in darkness was not a rescue operation in any conventional sense. No landing party could be dispatched from a Lancaster. No crewman could be recovered from occupied territory by simply circling above. The only practical purpose of turning back was to locate the missing aircraft, establish its condition if possible, and guide it toward home. It was a narrow possibility, but Cheshire decided it was worth attempting. The Lancaster turned east. Inside the aircraft, the change of course would have been immediately apparent. Navigation had to be recalculated. Fuel figures had to be reconsidered. Every additional minute increased the uncertainty of the return. The crew understood that they were deliberately moving back toward occupied Europe after completing their mission. Cheshire began searching through darkness for an aircraft that might no longer be airborne. There were no modern tracking systems. No satellite position reports. Radar existed, but it did not provide a simple, complete picture to every aircraft. Pilots depended on dead reckoning, visual observation, radio signals, and the experience of navigators who worked with charts and instruments under difficult conditions. The search brought no immediate answer. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. The farther Cheshire flew, the more dangerous the decision became. Fuel that had been calculated for the journey home was now being spent over enemy territory. If the missing aircraft could not be found, Cheshire would have to abandon the search and hope that his own Lancaster still had enough fuel to cross the North Sea. Eventually, the crew located the aircraft they had been searching for. It was still airborne, but in difficulty. The details of such encounters were rarely dramatic in the way later stories sometimes suggest. There was no clear rescue scene, no triumphant moment in which one aircraft simply led another to safety. The damaged bomber had its own problems, and Cheshire's crew could only provide limited assistance. But finding it mattered. In the darkness, an isolated crew could lose its bearings, become separated from a safe route, or continue toward a position from which returning would become impossible. Cheshire remained with the aircraft. That decision created a new operational problem. A Lancaster could not remain indefinitely in the air. The fuel gauges continued their slow movement downward. The navigator now had to calculate a route for 2 aircraft, taking into account their different conditions. The damaged bomber could not necessarily maintain the same speed or altitude. A route that was safe for one aircraft might be impossible for the other. The return westward was therefore slower and more complicated than the original flight. The 2 aircraft moved through the night toward the coast. Below them lay occupied territory. Somewhere behind and around them were German defenses that remained dangerous even after the bombing force had passed. Enemy fighters did not need to know that Cheshire's mission had already been completed. To a night fighter pilot, a Lancaster was simply a target. Cheshire could have turned away after locating the missing crew. Instead, he remained nearby for as long as circumstances allowed. By the time the aircraft reached the North Sea, the risk had changed but had not disappeared. The damaged bomber still had to cross open water. Weather over Britain could still prevent a safe landing. Fuel was now a concern for both crews. When Cheshire finally reached the English coast, the mission had lasted far longer than planned. The landing brought no parade, no immediate ceremony, and no dramatic announcement. Bomber Command was fighting a war in which extraordinary decisions occurred within an enormous machinery of routine. Operations rooms were already receiving reports from other crews. Ground staff were preparing for the next mission. Intelligence officers collected information about the target. Aircraft that had returned damaged were examined. Crews who had not returned were listed as missing until further information became available. The paperwork recorded what could be measured: aircraft number, crew names, time of takeoff, time of landing, target, bomb load, operational result. But paperwork was less capable of recording judgment. It could not easily capture the moment when a pilot looked at the route ahead, considered the fuel remaining, and chose to turn back toward danger for another crew. That was one of the reasons stories like Cheshire's could become blurred over time. Official records were designed to manage a vast military organization. They were not written primarily to preserve the private reasoning behind every decision. Orders and reports could show that an aircraft changed course. They could show delays and fuel usage. They could sometimes record unusual circumstances. But the human logic behind those actions often survived only in recollections, squadron memories, or later accounts. The incident also revealed a contradiction at the heart of Bomber Command. The organization depended on discipline. A large-scale bombing operation could not function if every pilot independently decided to alter the mission. Yet the same organization relied on individual judgment when circumstances collapsed into confusion. Pilots were trained to obey instructions, but they were also expected to bring damaged aircraft home, make emergency decisions, and preserve their crews whenever possible. Cheshire's decision sat directly inside that tension. From a strictly operational viewpoint, turning back could be criticized. It exposed another Lancaster and another 7 men to danger. It consumed fuel that might be needed later. It offered no guarantee of success. From the perspective of a man responsible for an aircraft and its crew, leaving behind another bomber known to be in trouble was a different kind of decision. No simple rule could completely resolve the conflict. Cheshire continued flying operations after that night. His career would eventually make him one of the most highly decorated airmen of the war, but that later recognition can obscure the more ordinary reality of operational life. Before medals and senior positions, he was one pilot among many who climbed into an aircraft at night and relied on a crew whose names were rarely remembered outside their immediate circle. The danger also continued to evolve. As the war progressed, Bomber Command faced increasingly sophisticated German defenses. Routes changed. Electronic countermeasures developed. New tactics were introduced. Aircraft losses remained severe. Experienced airmen became valuable not only because they knew how to fly, but because they had learned how quickly a mission could depart from its original plan. Cheshire himself would become deeply involved in improving bombing accuracy. He later developed methods of marking targets at low altitude, flying directly into some of the most heavily defended areas in Europe. Those actions brought him official recognition, including the Victoria Cross. Yet the earlier decision to turn back carried a different significance. It was not a carefully designed tactic. It did not involve a new weapon or a famous attack. It was an improvised choice made in the darkness after the main task was supposed to be over. For the missing crew, however, the distinction mattered very little. Their chances were shaped by an individual decision that could not have been guaranteed in advance. Cheshire did not possess the ability to solve every problem. He could not remove the enemy defenses, repair another aircraft in flight, or make fuel appear where none remained. He could only use the aircraft he had, the experience of his crew, and the limited time available. That was enough to change the immediate outcome. The official response reflected the nature of wartime institutions. Courage was recognized, but not every act of courage fit neatly into a citation. Awards tended to focus on sustained operations, clearly documented acts, or achievements that could be formally verified. A pilot turning back for another crew could be respected within a squadron without becoming the subject of a major official narrative. There was also a practical reason for silence. Military organizations were cautious about encouraging actions that could become dangerous precedents. If every crew returned to search for every missing aircraft, losses might increase. Commanders had to think beyond individual cases. The result was that the incident remained largely within the wider story of Cheshire's wartime service rather than standing alone as one of its defining moments. After the war, Cheshire's life took another direction. He left active military life and became involved in caring for people with severe illnesses and disabilities, eventually founding what became the Leonard Cheshire organization. The transformation from bomber pilot to humanitarian worker was striking, but it followed a pattern visible throughout his life: an attention to individuals who might otherwise become invisible within larger systems. The wartime records could list an aircraft as missing. Hospitals could reduce a patient to a diagnosis. Institutions could function through categories, numbers, and procedures. Cheshire repeatedly encountered the limits of that approach. The night he turned back over occupied Europe was not proof that one man could ignore the realities of war. On the contrary, the decision was dangerous precisely because those realities were so severe. Fuel was limited. Enemy defenses were real. Search capability was almost non-existent. The possibility of success was uncertain. That was what made the choice meaningful. Years later, the war would be remembered through major battles, famous commanders, and enormous statistics. Bomber Command alone lost tens of thousands of aircrew. Behind every total were individual crews who took off from English airfields and disappeared into cloud, darkness, or enemy territory. Some returned with damaged aircraft. Some returned without all their crew. Some never returned at all. Cheshire survived long enough for his name to become known, but many of the men around him did not. Their stories remained scattered through squadron records, cemetery registers, letters, and fading recollections. The official documents preserved dates and aircraft numbers with impressive precision. The reasons behind individual decisions were often less visible. Somewhere in those records was the evidence of a Lancaster that had completed its mission, changed course, and spent additional time over enemy territory. The full human meaning of that maneuver could not be contained in a column of figures. A heading might record an aircraft's time of return. Another might note that a crew had been located or that an operation had taken longer than expected. None of those entries could fully describe the moment when the pilot understood what turning back might cost and did it anyway. That is why the story remained easy to overlook. It did not fit neatly into the standard history of bombing campaigns. It did not alter a battle plan or destroy a major target. It did not produce a dramatic photograph or a famous quotation. It was a decision made after the main action, when the safer choice appeared to be continuing home. Instead, Leonard Cheshire turned back. For the men still struggling through the darkness, that choice meant they were no longer alone in the sky.